this opportunity to celebrate these terrific books. They're rigorously argued, thought-provoking, and compelling reads. My focus today is on Helen's book, but it's been a joy to read them both. So there is an intuitive sense that when, as the Star Trek villains, the Borg, would say, resistance is futile, defensive force remains permissible. A woman unable to prevent a rape does not seem to wrong her attacker by breaking his wrist. And you can break Tadros' wrist by sitting down late.
Thanks.
Whereas the futile defense cases seem permissible, other acts of necessary defense do not. May I shoot a culpable aggressor when I can safely escape? It seems that I would act impermissibly in so doing. These cases are distinct, despite the fact that in both instances, defensive force is in some sense unnecessary. In the first, the defensive force appears ineffective and thereby unnecessary, whereas in the second, the defensive force would be effective but remains unnecessary to prevent the harm to the victim. In her book, Helen Frowe claims that some acts of ineffective defense are not ineffective after all. Rather, some force may be proportionate to defending the victim's honor. She's willing to extend this defensive honor to cases of the second type, allowing some harm to attackers even when the victims may safely retreat. In this paper, I begin by setting forth the central cases of futile defense and eliminating distracting cases that misunderstand the nature and justification of self-defense. I then consider one justification for harming in futile defense cases that Frowe rejects, which is punitive reasons. I argue that punitive reasons can justify harming the attacker in futile defense cases and show that Frowe's deferred harming objection to punitive reasons fails. From there, I consider Frowe's claim that some force is justified because the victim is defending her honor. I find this claim to be a bit hard to pin down, and thus address different conceptions and claims about how honor may work. I then consider a more general question that requires further explanation, and this is the relationship between the defender's intentions, liability, reasons, and all things considered permissibility. The focus on internalism and externalism about necessity, that is, whether necessity is an internal condition to the aggressor's being liable to harm, has obscured a far more natural way of thinking about self-defense, which is simply to focus on when a right is forfeited and when an action is all things considered permissible. Frowe uses these conceptions elsewhere in the book. I begin by seeking to add an additional factor, which is whether the defender must be acting in light of the defensive reason. Focusing on this additional question reveals a broader puzzle about the relationship between the defender's intention and all things considered permissibility. I then focus on counter-defense in unnecessary defense cases, arguing that a more focused understanding of when, how, and to whom aggressors may lose defensive rights can explain when aggressors may fight back against unnecessary disproportionate force. Okay, so futile defense cases, the central case in question. So within this category, it's important to put one class of cases to the side. As Frowe rightly observed, as David Roden noted before, the original puzzle, as Danny Statman introduced it, included cases with multiple aggressors, right? And you don't have to do any fancy footwork to understand why Alice, when she's being threatened with being raped by 5 men, gets to kill 2 of them, even if 3 will still rape her. Rights are relational. If she kills Albert and Bob, she is actually successfully defending herself against rape by Albert and Bob. So those aren't futile defense cases at all. I think that Frowe is right to focus instead on a case originally presented by Kwong and Firth, which is rape, right? So we're all familiar from the book with rape, which is Eric is in the midst of culpably raping Fran. Eric's much bigger and stronger than Fran, and subsequently there's nothing Fran can do to stop Eric. While she's being raped, Fran threatens to break Eric's wrist, though this will do nothing to stop the rape from occurring. The only way Eric can stop Fran from breaking his wrist is to quickly break her wrist first. So one immediate question has got to be whether Fran believes her action will stop the attack. I'm going to return to that issue later. For now, I want to proceed on Frowe's assumption that Fran knows that breaking Eric's wrist cannot prevent the rape. Thus, her action is not being done with the intention of defending herself against the sexual assault. So, I think in terms of thinking about whether or not Fran can break Eric's wrist, that it's extremely plausible that punitive reasons exist and support Fran's actions, and that Frowe has not successfully ruled punitive reasons out of consideration. So in terms of punitive reasons, we can be talking about either desert or deterrence generally. So Frowe considers these and finds two objections that have been mounted to be surmountable. One is that we traditionally don't allow private individuals, as she says, to dish out punishment, but she says that, in fact, the aggressor is liable to this harm, and any punishment received at the hands of the defender can just be deducted from the later punishment the state imposes. Her second worry is that we usually don't let private citizens, or she thinks this is a surmountable worry, we don't let private citizens dish out punishment because of their epistemic failures, right? They might, in fact, get the wrong guy. But during the rape, it seems really unlikely that Fran is misjudging whether or not Eric is culpably attacking her. And so Frowe thinks that this is likewise a surmountable objection. Her central objection to punitive reasons is deferred harming, which is, if it's punishment, why can't Fran go and break Eric's wrist the next day? So Frowe says, liability to punishment is triggered by engaging in wrongdoing, but persists once the wrongdoing has ceased. And so when we ask, how can the reason that applies to letting the state be the one to punish attackers, she says, somehow gets stronger once the attack has ended. But it's hard to see why this would be the case. Unlike defensive action, there's typically no urgency about punitive measures. That is, if there are punitive reasons available to Fran at the time of the rape, why is she then constrained from harming him later? From raising this puzzle, Frowe just concludes, quote, if we do not think murderer and Eric are liable to suffer deferred harm at the hands of their victims, we will need to reject punishment as the source of liability to non-defensive harm. So either she's rejecting that punitive reasons exist, or she's rejecting that they are available to Fran, and I find neither claim plausible. So first, to consider that punitive reasons don't exist would be to think that they somehow aren't generated at the time of the rape. That can't be true. Consider first desert. Eric, by virtue of his culpable wrongdoing, deserves to be punished. If so, this reason exists at the time of the rape. What about deterrence? Right, this claim is going to be both stronger and weaker. It is weaker in the sense that deterrence is empirically contingent, right? Either it will deter future aggression or it won't. When it will, the reason exists. When it won't, the reason doesn't. In that sense, it's weaker. But when the reason does exist, there's no doubt that it exists during the rape itself. Hence, even if you think punishment requires the state, deterring aggression clearly does not. So the fact that these reasons exist does create the puzzle of deferred harming. So how might we account for the fact that Fran can't punish Eric later? So to my mind, the best answer to this is going to draw on the state's role and potential monopoly on punishment. What Fran does wrong, in a sense, I think, is to take over the state's role. It's punishing when really the state should be punishing. But when she does this, she's not violating Eric's rights. And this wrong of usurping the state's role might actually be excused during the rape, but it would not be once she is no longer in the heat of the moment. Moreover, the possible wrongful effect of encouraging vigilantism and undermining procedural rights would certainly increase once the state was available to punish. That said, I think in next day rape, or whatever the case is labeled, late rape, but it's actually late wrist breaking. If she breaks his wrist the next day, I think he fully deserves it. Hence, desert's a reason for Fran to act, and in some sense, good downstream effects of deterrence are also a reason. Now, one move would be to say these reasons do exist, but Frowe means to say they are never available to Fran. Fran is not entitled to punish. Now, given that Frowe explicitly rejects the argument about not allowing individuals to dish out punishment just 2 pages prior, I don't really think that move is supported by the text, right? Does she mean to say that these surmountable objections are not really surmountable after all? Moreover, I'm not convinced victims can't give the aggressors what they deserve, and we can't just come up with an idea within political morality to account for this deferred harming. Why we have to say that it's simply never available to Fran is unclear to me. The more difficult question, and one which I will return to in a bit, is what intention Fran must have while harming Eric. That is, a better argument Frowe could make against access to punitive reasons is that an action cannot be considered punitive unless the harm is inflicted with the intention to punish. Thus, there is a possibility of mismatch between what Fran believes she's doing and the reasons that support it. I'm going to return to that mismatch in a moment. So Frowe argues that defending honor is a better explanation for our intuitions that futile defensive actions are permissible. They are not futile after all. Fran is successfully defending her honor. In articulating how this might be so, she endorses Statman's claim that, quote, in the eyes of the aggressor, we are just items to be used, mere objects, end quote. And she approvingly cites Barbara Herman's formulation that one may defend against an aggressor because he would use me, take my life for his purposes. From here, Frowe does a bit of synthesis and extrapolation, maintaining this sort of argument only applies to culpable aggressors who demonstrate some inappropriate lack of regard for the victim. Understanding what is at stake in the attack is essential to determining what sorts of response is proportionate. Here, Frowe concurs with Statman's assessment that the attack on honor is key to the gravity of the underlying threat. Frowe concludes that threats to honor are not as bad as the primary threats. Even when the primary threat is rape or killing, she argues, contra Statman, that the corresponding threat to honor only justifies imposition of a moderate harm, like a broken wrist or arm. More force would not be necessary, Frowe asserts, because the defensive harm is conveying one's assertion that one will not be passive and complicit, and that one is a person worthy of better treatment. Moreover, defending honor comes with its own success, as it is in the trying that one reasserts one's dignity. Now, Frowe is cognizant that she's got to come up with a limit lest the deferred harming objection hoist her on her own petard. She suggests that to the extent that the threat to honor supervenes on the primary harm, then the threat to honor is over when the primary threat is over. The defender might seek restoration of honor, but she cannot prevent the harm that's done. Frowe then considers an extension of defending honor to instances where force is unnecessary because lesser means are available to the defender. And this is her lucky escape case. So in lucky escape, murderer is trying to kill victim because he dislikes victim. He chases victim to the edge of the cliff. Unbeknownst to murderer, victim has two things, a parachute and a gun. So he can save his life either by just simply jumping to safety while using no force against murderer, or by shooting and killing murderer. Because Frowe takes necessity to be an external restriction on the use of permissible self-defense, she claims murderer is liable to defensive force, so he cannot kill victim in counter-defense. But victim still acts impermissibly in shooting him. Hence, according to Frowe, even if culpable aggressors have forfeited their rights, it is not, all things considered, permissible to kill them unnecessarily. Despite the fact that it is unnecessary for victim to kill murderer, Frowe maintains that some use of force can be necessary as a means of victim defending his honor. Right? Since murderer poses a lethal threat, it will be proportionate for victim to inflict quite significant harm to defend his honor, and thus a substantial component of the lethal harm victim inflicts will satisfy the necessity constraint. Murderer is entitled to use force only to the extent that victim's harm is disproportionate to the honor defense. Right. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that we may use a mild amount of force to defend our honor and dignity. That said, as I started with, it's hard to pin down what exactly we mean by defending honor. And admittedly, Frowe's book tries to do quite a bit in a short number of pages. I understand OUP can be stingy about their pages. But before one signs on to hooray for Fran and her honor, let's raise some cautionary questions and see if we can tease out these different notions. So the first thing is, what does it mean to threaten honor? So in rape, two things are going on. One is that Eric is using Fran as a means, and the other is that Eric is culpable. I think that even though there are quotes from Statman and Herman about using, that using is not necessary to constitute an attack on honor if attacking honor is to be understood as manifesting a disrespectful attitude. So consider a purposeful eliminative killing. A woman decides that, in fact, she's jealous her boyfriend has dumped her for another, and she decides to just shoot her competitor dead, right, hoping that then he'll return to her. This killing is, and it's inspired by the Mrs. Hyam case, for those of you who teach it. So the killing here is clearly eliminative, not opportunistic. She doesn't want to disrespect this woman. She just wants the other woman to go away. I would also think that cases of recklessness can also manifest that disrespect. If I drive quickly past your house to watch the Knicks game, not caring that I might hit you, I would never do that to watch the Knicks game. But then, in fact, my insufficient concern for your interest should count in the same way. So Larry Alexander and I have argued that culpability just is manifesting insufficient concern for others' interests. And it seems that the idea Frowe is after here is not opportunistic use, but rather the manifestation of an attitude that the victim doesn't count. It's that disrespect to which the victim is responding. So I think she'd agree, but the quotes from Statman, Herman, and sometimes remarks from Frowe point sometimes to opportunistic use. So then the question is, what's the relationship between the attack on honor and the primary harm? One might wonder whether culpable attacks, even if they don't cause harm themselves, still constitute attacks on honor such that one may harm culpable attempters. So an implication of Frowe's claim in Lucky Escape is that honor itself is sufficient for defensive force. Indeed, at one point, she seems to say that the difference between inchoate crimes and coate crimes is just the difference between defending your honor and defending your armor and preventing the person from harming you. But that would mean that if I intend to kill Helen and I point a gun at her and she knows the gun is unloaded, but I do not, she is permitted to break my wrist to prevent me from pulling the trigger, because by pulling the trigger, I would be manifesting a disrespectful attitude to her. Do I really succeed in dishonoring her if I fail in my attempt? I reveal I'm culpable and don't respect her, but is she truly permitted to break my wrist just to stop me from pulling the trigger of an unloaded gun? So as a matter of reporting one's intuitions, I'll admit that I find it far less plausible that one is entitled to use force in these cases. On the other hand, once you tie honor to the primary harm, then it seems to create the opposite problem, which is that the attack on honor cannot be thwarted unless the primary harm is. So consider the claim by John Gardner and Stephen Shute that the primary wrong in rape just is opportunistic use. If the most abhorrent thing about rape is using the other person as a means, and that can't be stopped, then in what sense is honor being defended? If one manifests disrespect by engaging in culpable action, if the action cannot be stopped, how then is the attack on honor thwarted? So maybe we should stop thinking that defending honor is the same sort of action as other sorts of defensive force. That is, rather than thinking that you're harming the aggressor to somehow avert a threat to honor in the way that physical harms avert physical threats, perhaps defending honor is more expressive than defensive. And I think Frowe equivocates a bit on her conception. Sometimes she talks about defending honor, being proportionate to averting a threat, defending against a threat to her honor, and these phrases indicate the conduct will avert the harm. However, other passages point to a more expressive view. So I'm just going to quote this because I think it's important. When we think about what it is that such harms try to convey, a refusal to be passive, a refusal to be complicit, a means of asserting yourself as a person of worthy of better treatment, it seems that even in the face of a serious threat to one's honor, such as that present during rape, inflicting a moderate harm upon one's attacker, a broken limb, for example, would suffice to manifest such an attitude, which is what constitutes the defense of one's honor. So in this sense, fighting back has some sort of intrinsic expressive value. It comes with its own success condition as merely fighting back one's reasserting one's worth. I think this idea is deeply entrenched. Anybody who sat through a child's sporting event has watched your child play a team knowing they're going to lose and have told them, don't throw in the towel, play it out, right? Knows that there's some value, right, in continuing to fight against certain defeat. It's probably the ethos behind do not go gentle into that good night, rage against the dying of the light, right? So part of the rationale for why resistance is valuable may trade on some sort of epistemic uncertainty, that you shouldn't resign yourself to failure because you may actually win, right? Fight back, right? Defensive force might work. So Fran should fight to try to stop Eric. Still, as a parent who sat through too many sporting events knows, sometimes one team knows they're going to lose, and we still see value in fighting until the end. In thinking about the value in this resistance, we can also gain insight by thinking about its converse, which is not fighting back. Now, both Herman and Frowe use the term complicit to denote one's role in the injury to oneself if one does not fight back. In some ways, this is a staggering accusation. Someone hurts me, and if I do not fight back, I am part of the problem. I'm hurting myself, right? That's neither conceptually nor normatively attractive or plausible, right? Conceptually, we've never thought complicity counted unless it was one's purpose that the harm be caused. Normatively, it seems to add insult to injury to say that someone who is being attacked is required to fight against the attack lest she be dishonoring herself. Right? There are good reasons why the law abandoned the requirement in rape that women resist to the utmost, lest they be seen as consenting to the actual attack. And so I think that we should be cautious of using language like complicit. But although I don't think that we should place a duty on the victim to resist, I think we can grant significance of the attitude expressed when one does resist. One's behavior just is the reassertion of oneself and one's value. One is not required to do this, but there is expressive meaning that is communicated by this act in reasserting one's value in the face of the attack. But this way of thinking of honor raises 4 questions to my mind. How does the aggressor become liable to the expression of honor? How does this play out in lucky escape? How does it relate to necessity? And how does it survive the deferred harming objection? So, in some ways, it seems obvious that when one expresses or defends one's honor, you do it against the attacker. I don't doubt that's true. At this point, I wish only to express the concern that we may need to avail ourselves of additional explanatory resources to articulate why it is that Fran gets to harm Eric as a way of saying, I respect myself, you ought to respect me. Although I will return to the necessity question momentarily, for now, the question on the table is simply, why is it that the attacker must absorb a harm that is expressing something? That is, we are asking whether Eric has forfeited a right against this sort of harming, where the forfeiture is supposed to be grounded in neither desert nor defense. So it may be that we get to say that when you violate someone else's rights and you do so culpably and you manifest disrespect, you can't complain when the rejection of that message is accompanied by force and reply. The alternative would be to say that actors do not forfeit rights against expression of honor. Rather, like deterrence, expressive reasons can serve to justify harms that the agent does not have a right against. Right? Importantly, we then have to give an account that doesn't collapse into defense or desert. So defending honor just needs further explanation in terms of how it relates either to the forfeiture condition or to all things considered permissibility. I'm also not convinced that expression of honor is what's doing the work in lucky escape. Right? So lucky escape raises a question that has been debated in criminal law theory and self-defense for quite some time, and that's just the duty to retreat. Retreat has long been understood to be part of the necessity calculation. The liability and autonomy interest that one has to stand one's ground and not surrender one's position, right, exists and can be protected. And it has to be protected proportionately. So we might grant that there's an autonomy interest at work in lucky escape, and in that sense an honor interest that allows the use of some force. After all, we are asking victim to jump off a cliff. And even with a parachute, it seems to be a lot to ask. This notion of defending honor, in defending a space you're lawfully entitled to be, exists independently of the notion that murderer is dishonoring the victim by attacking him. Here he is clearly defending the rightful space, and this is an interest that is properly taken into account in what the victim may defend in lucky escape. In contrast, I suspect the expressive value in not giving up in the face of defeat has no purchase in lucky escape, right? It seems as though when you know you can get away without, in fact, being harmed at all, saying, I count, as a matter of poetic justice, seems almost dishonorable as opposed to honorable, right? So I'm not clear that those two actually engage the same conceptions of honor. Another problem for any notion of honor, then, is whether it actually solves the necessity problem or simply relocates it. As Helen would phrase it, has she only moved the bump in the carpet? I love that phrase. I learned it from her. I think it depends on if we have our notion on the right framing of what the defender is doing. To the extent that you're just signaling, I'm not going to be complicit, I deny your message, it doesn't seem to me the case has been made that force is necessary. If Fran just wants to deny Eric's message, she could look at him and say, you're raping me. I am not just a means to your end. She could sing a couple bars from Whitney Houston's The Greatest Love of All, right? No matter what you take from me, you can't take away my dignity. If she really wants Eric to suffer, she can voice activate her iPhone so that Mel Gibson's Braveheart quote of, they can take our lives, but they can't take our freedom is played, right? Why would physical harm be necessary to reassert herself as an end in herself? Hence, even if Eric is liable to moderate harm as a matter of proportionality, the necessity problem simply reasserts itself at the level of honor. On the other hand, if fighting back is valuable because of the meaning of a tenacious fight, then perhaps only certain actions will do. If blowing a raspberry simply lacks the same expressive function as breaking a wrist, we may resolve the necessity quandary because the action reasserts honor as an end in itself, such that more assertion is more meaning, is more honor, right? Then the necessity objection may dissolve. But I need to know the precise mechanics to know whether, in fact, the necessity problem has been resolved or has simply reappeared as a new problem. All right, defending harming. So finally, let's talk about deferred harming. Even assuming we're talking about otherwise futile defense cases, and even assuming the violence does assist in allowing the victim to reassert her honor, we must ask whether this conception rules out deferred harming. After all, we have shifted from a notion of averting a threat to a notion of expressing one's honor. But why does the communication have to be contemporaneous with the attack then? Right? So in the television show The Newsroom, which probably no one in this room watches, right? A woman's ex-boyfriend, thank you. So Sloane Sabbath's ex-boyfriend posts revenge porn, right? Naked pictures of her on the internet. She's very upset by this. She goes to his office, knees him in the groin, and punches him in the face, right? Why does this count as an assertion of her honor if she does it while he's pressing send, but not the moment later, right? If the value in honor is the expression and not the prevention of dishonoring, the requirement that expression be contemporaneous seems ad hoc. So for the very reasons I suggested with respect to punitive reasons, I think we should simply embrace the thought that these reasons do remain in force even after the attack is over. The fact that victims are required to stay their hands is simply a result of a political morality that requires victims to yield to the state. In the absence of the state, do we really think Fran fails to express her honor if she breaks Eric's wrist the next week? I doubt it. So I don't express that my brief survey of these questions has yielded definitive answers. I do hope, however, to have advanced the inquiry such that when we think about honor, we can at least unpack exactly what we're talking about so that we might know how it actually relates to these objections. So with the minimal amount of time I have left, I want to turn to two broader questions. So at this point, we should recognize that myriad reasons may justify Fran's conduct. Harming Eric may be justified as a matter of desert, as a matter of deterrence, as a matter of asserting her moral worth. And perhaps all three of these extend temporally beyond the rape itself. Similarly, in lucky escape, some harm is due and owing to murderer as a result of desert, deterrence, defense of standing his ground, maybe some other sort of honor. I want to suggest the way we should put these pieces together, a way that I think would be congenial to Frowe's positions and would offer a new challenge to punitive reasons. So let's consider Eric first. Is Eric liable to defensive force? Frowe and I would both say yes, though I would say Eric is only liable to force that Fran believes is defensively required, right? So she at least has to intend it defensively. That's going to matter for lucky escape later. So let's assume that Fran acts to defend herself, but breaking his wrist is futile. What should we say? I think we should say that Eric is liable, but that the harm can't be, all things considered, permissible unless it's supported by reasons. Since I'm not going to go evidence relative about necessity, I would say there's no defensive reason here. It's not supported by reasons because it can't succeed. Enter Frowe's conception of honor. To the extent honor has intrinsic value, and Eric remembers not being wronged, that harming then is supported by reasons. Well, what about punitive reasons? Well, Frowe is going to have to concede that defenders can deter aggression by fighting back. And then whether it's true just depends on the facts. But what about desert? I think the defenders of punitive reasons have a problem. Are these reasons available to Fran? Ordinarily, we don't think you're punishing someone unless you act with punitive intentions. So assume Albert and Bob really dislike Carl and they decide to go beat the crap out of him, right? Carl, it turns out, is a rapist who deserves more than that, right? And he has not been caught and punished. When Albert and Bob beat up Carl, unaware of the desert-based reasons that obtain, are they punishing him? Now, notably, Fran has a good intention, unlike Albert and Bob, but it's still odd to think that this counts as punishment. Unlike the deferred harming objection, then, this one might have teeth. Of course, one final question would then be whether expressing honor likewise requires an intention. Culpability doesn't, right? The fact that the aggressor manifests disrespect doesn't require him to intend to manifest disrespect. But we need to be clearer about exactly what expressing honor is, because some conceptions might make this reason unavailable to Fran unless she intends to, unless she acts with an expressive intention. Ultimately, to the extent that one is only liable to people who act for specific reasons, a position I'm not alone in holding, Jeff cited that in Killing in War, we will need an account of what happens when an actor's good intentions are not supported by reasons, but other reasons exist that might in fact support all things considered permissibility. And we need to figure out what to do if those reasons typically are only thought to be available if the actor acts in light of them. Right. So my final question is whether we should be on board with Frowe's approach to lucky escape. Frowe takes a somewhat peculiar path that I think ought to be carefully parsed. One result Frowe thinks we ought to reach is that murderer cannot kill victim. I think we all agree murderer can't kill victim in lucky escape. However, Frowe does think that murderer can fight back against disproportionate force. I believe that conclusion is incorrect on the terms of Frowe's own argument. Moreover, I worry that Frowe's cabining of her inquiry, ignoring other resources that might explain some of these situations, blocks from view a better explanation of the moral landscape. So Frowe argues that murder is liable in lucky escape, arguing for what she calls externalism about necessity. Though I agree with Frowe that the necessity limitation is not best seen as an internal limit on liability, I whether the internalism-externalism debate is the most perspicuous way to see this. Ultimately, the question is whether liability is only forfeiture or it's forfeiture that in fact also includes a reason. The relationship, I think, between liability and reasons is under-examined, right? So one can contrast Victor's view, which is that liability requires this duty, this affirmative reason, with McMahon's approach, where one has to have an instrumental defensive reason, or with my approach, which is that liability is just about forfeiture. On my view, once there is forfeiture, then the question is how the fact that the defender's conduct will not constitute a rights violation links to the determination of all things considered permissibility. Necessity then serves as a limit to the extent that we think that the interests of culpable aggressors remain, even if their rights not to be harmed do not. So Frowe's proportionate means externalism is thus better expressed as a claim about rights forfeiture and a recognition that harming and the extent of harming must be supported by reasons, proportionate means. I think Frowe holds the same view and espouses it in the book, so I think that these extra labels are somewhat distracting. So with lucky escape, killing murderer is not supported by reasons. Although I share Frowe's externalism, I part company with Frowe in thinking that internalists lack the resources to explain why murderer cannot fight back. As I previously argued, individuals who start fights may lose defensive rights despite the fact that the responder still wrongs the provocateur by injuring him, right? So murderer provokes it, he's not allowed to fight back. This is a widespread position across the United States and arguably represents the considered judgment of a large populace. So it at least strikes me that philosophers need to take seriously this thing that is sort of widespread throughout the law. Irrespective of whether Frowe finds the provocateur explanation plausible, there remains the problem that Frowe's analysis fails on its own terms. She maintains that murder is liable to be killed, but such killing is not, all things considered, permissible. But to Frowe, that is not the end of the matter, because murder is liable to some necessary force as a matter of victim defending his honor. So harming is permissible, and the murderer cannot defend against that. But what if the victim goes overboard and uses more force than is justified to defend his honor? Frowe then maintains that murderer can then defend himself. Quote, he may therefore use force to defend himself against the excess harm that exceeds what victim may inflict in defending his honor. Murderer therefore has a limited right of counter-defense. I find this result curious. The root of the trouble, I think, is that using internalism and externalism obscures the relationship between liability and reasons. Consider a hypothetical about the relationship between rights and reasons. My neighbor wants to cut through my grass to get to the street. He comes up to me and he says, may I do this? Begrudgingly, I consent, right? I'd really rather not have him trample my grass, but I consent nevertheless. Now, assume that my neighbor has another way to access the street after I've consented. It seems it's not, all things considered, permissible for him to trample my grass when he need not do so. But am I entitled to push him off my lawn as a matter of enforcing the lesser evil? Or having waived my right, am I prevented from any further enforcement of the very same interest at stake? The question is what to make of an interest that is not protected by a right when harming that interest is still, all things considered, impermissible. The murderer's interest is not protected by a right. He gave it up by attacking. On Frowe's view, murder is liable to defensive force, deadly defensive force. The reason why deadly force may not be used is because although murderer is liable, it is not, all things considered, permissible, and this is because reasons only support using force that is necessary. But the question is whether interests that are not protected by rights, because those rights have been forfeited or waived, may be asserted as interests by the very agents who have forfeited or waived their rights. I would think that a comprehensive view of what it means to forfeit or waive a right includes the inability to assert it. My allowance of my neighbors walking across my grass prevents me from stopping him or complaining about the harm to my interests, even if, all things considered, he ought not to walk across my grass. It's then an interesting question whether third parties could actually enforce the lesser evil when I could not. So because I adopt intention internalism, that is, I require the defender to believe her actions are necessary to defend against the harm, irrespective of whether it is necessary, I would deny murderer is liable to defensive force because victim doesn't believe force is necessary. Instead, the question for me would be whether murderer provoked the use of force such that he forfeits his defensive rights. On my view, murderer is wronged by victim's use of unnecessary force, but may not be able to defend against it. On Frowe's view, murderer is not wronged by victim's use of unnecessary force, but may nevertheless use force against it on lesser evil's principles. Frowe need not take that position, however. Even if she chooses to reject a provocateur principle, her view that murderer is liable should require that murderer stay his hand, even if the force is ultimately impermissible. The necessity limitation, therefore, stands at the crossroads we have between forfeiture and, all things considered, permissibility. We have to know its role in determining when the aggressor has forfeited and when it supports reasons to harm those who have forfeited their rights. And so our quest to find reasons for why Fran may use force is only the first step in a much larger inquiry. So thank you.
Okay, Helen.
Well, thanks so much, Kim. That's really fantastic. It's enormously helpful. And I think I'm sympathetic to an awful lot of what you say, actually. And I think you've done my job for me, really. Maybe you could write this chapter in the next edition. So yeah, this is great. So on the punitive, so I'll just say something briefly about the punitive stuff, because I think that's interesting. So on your view, would it be that Fran only has an excuse if she breaks the risk, and if she breaks Eric's wrist and she doesn't believe that it's defensive, because she's doing something that is the proper job of the state, so she wouldn't be justified?
So I think so she doesn't think it's defensive at the time?
She knows it won't about the rape.
Wait, does she think it's punitive? I'm sorry, that's what I meant to ask.
She hasn't thought about that.
So I'm actually really puzzled by this mismatch of reasons question. But separate and apart from the mismatch of reasons, I think she doesn't wrong Eric, right? But that in fact, in terms of the wrong of usurping the role of the state, she would only have an excuse.
Okay. So I guess that's somewhere where I think we might disagree, because my intuition is that she's justified in breaking his wrist, and that's the puzzle I'm trying to solve, is how can it be justified? And I'm worried that your sort of take on the punitive reasons and the role that we solve the deferred harming problem by saying something like, well, look, it really is the state that gets punished and so on, that is only going to give her a justification in the kind of case that is only going to give her an excuse in the kind of case that I'm interested in which she knows it's not defensive, and I guess I'm thinking, and she doesn't intend it as punishment, because it seems to me that there could be cases like that, right? That seems like a typical case. She's not thinking about punishment. She doesn't intend this as a punitive harm, but she knows it's going to do nothing. And that's kind of the case I was dealing with. So I'm not sure whether I want to make the moves you're suggesting for the deferred harming point. Do you want to?
Well, the one thing that's interesting is we kind of need to figure out what Fran is thinking, I think. I actually think that's relevant to the entire analysis.
So
what is she doing?
So you're kind of right about the pages. So in a longer version of this chapter, I go through each of the variations of what she might be thinking. But I decided this was the most interesting case for my purposes of what I wanted to think about. So I guess I'm also wondering about what the reasons justify, right, is the question here. So I think the distinction you draw is really interesting between the idea of punitive reasons existing, so I agree with you, absolutely, right, so these are triggered when Eric engages in the wrongdoing, and then we have the question, so you say, well, what we're thinking about here is whether they're available to Fran. And it's not so much a question of whether these are, it depends what we mean to say that they're reasons available to Fran, right? We want to know what she can do in light of these reasons. And it sounds to me like you're saying, well, actually, she doesn't get to do anything because this is the job of the state. Is that?
Yeah, it was just a potential gesture at an answer, which is, I think that whatever answer we have has to do with the fact that we think that the state's role looms larger later than it does at the time. So we might have a theory that when you're being attacked, it's sort of state of nature and you get to administer punishment, and then that would get me everything, right? Or you might have a theory, you're not supposed to do this, but we can understand why she is. Right, so she's sitting there going, this, jerk is attacking me and I can't stop it, but at least I'm going to break his wrist because he deserves it, right? Then we have to ask the question, do you think she's allowed to do that? I don't think she wrongs him, right? Then the question is, do you think that that's wrong vis-a-vis the state? And you'd have to have a much broader theory to explain that.
And so, and you also think that, if I follow correctly, towards the end of the paper, that Eric is liable to harm if Fran believes that it's necessary for defense.
So there are two separate questions here, right? So you and I agree, although you're going to say it's not liability to defensive harm. You and I both agree that sometimes when you think it's necessary, even though it's not defensive harm, the aggressor has forfeited rights. I think there's a separate question, though, which is, let's say that whether or not the defensive harming could succeed, does the person have to, it's the match between your view of what defensive action and defensive harming is. In a longer version of this paper, there was more explanation of, I never see those pieces put together such that the question of whether, is Eric liable to harms that, like sprinkler, are you liable to harm in sprinkler? Or is it that there's no liability except to those individuals who understand their actions to be defensive, right? So, and I wasn't clear what you saw the relationship between those two to be.
Yeah, so I think this is part of the book that I mean, this whole part of the book is something that I'm probably least confident about in the book. And one of the things I think I've probably changed my mind on is that actually in light of the conversation that we had in Delaware, about whether we should say that people are liable to harms that their victims inflict in the course of trying to defend themselves. So in the book I say that you can be liable to those kinds of harms, but I think actually that's a mistake, because if you have the kind of view of liability that I have that holds that you can only be liable to instrumental harm, so Jeff and I disagree on this because he thinks you can only be liable to the least harmful means. I think you can be liable to proportionate means that aren't necessarily the least harmful means. And it seems like then it can't be true that in cases where I've I wrongly believe that harming you is necessary, it can't be true that you're liable because harming you is not in fact instrumental in averting a threat. So I wonder whether, I've kind of changed my mind about some of those things. But maybe that's enough that I can say for now.
All right, questions? Alec, anyone else can answer?
So, Kimberly, I loved that presentation. I wish I had read the paper further before we got here. I have a short little question and then a more engaged comment. The short little question has to do with your particular statement. So you focused on the rape case, if I'm being raped by 5 people and I can't prevent all the rapes, it's still useful to prevent a couple of the rapes. And that clearly is right, because I assume, and I've never been raped, that each rape is an awful thing in itself. Not so true with killing, right? I get killed by 5 people, I get killed by 1 people, I'm just dead, right? Unless there's some sort of particular awfulness of the way 5 people would kill me, but think about the John Wayne machinist, and it's just not so clearly true that there's anything analogous to the rape situation going on to explain why he is doing something that's not futile when he continues to shoot people knowing he's going to die in the end anyway. I know Helen makes that point too, but I'm just pushing back a little bit that clarification. But that's the little one I care about.
Okay.
The more significant one is about intentions internalism. I want to float a suggestion and see what you're saying.
Okay.
The suggestion is that it's true for certain kinds of things and not for others. So I think punishment is the kind of thing which is inherently expressive. So if someone isn't trying to punish, they can't be punishing, and doing what might affect the same harms as punishing, if they're not punishing, it may just be impermissible to do it. Right? It's not like a case of self-defense where or other defense. So let's say other defense is even cleaner. I want to save Victor. I keep saying Victor. He's very funny. So I want to save Victor from Jeff. Good luck, right? Actually, the thing is, Victor needs saving from Jeff, but I have no idea that's the case. I'm just really pissed off at Jeff, so I attack Jeff. Now, I think the great thing to say about me is I did something that was itself a permissible thing to do, but I behaved culpably well to make it. Right? So there's a difference between the blame dimension and the permissibility dimension. That doesn't seem to be true in the punishment case, and I think it's because of the nature of the justification for the different acts. I wonder if you would find that helpful.
Okay, so speaking of versions of the paper that didn't get, I even had, I had a Helen drawing and for a handout and everything. I know, it was crazy, but it got too long. So, I want to say about death to begin with. I mean, the problem is you're always going to die, right? So you're always operating against that question. So I think that it's still going to be a question of whether one person or another person violates your rights, and even if you're not going to violate my rights, and that means Ada Liz, I still think I'm allowed to prevent you from actually wronging me, despite the fact that I might still be harmed, that I'm entitled to defend myself against that wrong. I think there's a really interesting question about how you individuate these things and how closely you can individuate them. So I'm kind of not ready to fully but the case was something like, you're trapped in an enclosure that's 10 by 10, and we'll have Victor's got a sniper and he's got 5 bullets, and I'm stuck in there and I've got 1 rock. So do I get to throw the rock at him, say to take out his eye if that redirects the first bullet, if he's still gonna hit me with the second, right? I mean, there's gonna be something about how fine-grained we start individuating these things. We do need a theory of that. So I agree with you, there's something there to push on, but Statman's cases that get the most purchase are these multiple aggressor cases where he's wrong. And what happens is he winds up thinking, and Helen points this out, that you're allowed to kill people to defend your honor. And it's really because those cases aren't futile defense cases at all. So more broadly, so when you think about, so I decide I want to kill you, you decide you want to kill me. Right? We're both pointing guns at each other under the table. I'm not inclined to think that either of those are cases of permissible self-defense. I think that, in fact, the defensive intention is actually internal to the rights forfeiture. But I have an entire, I probably can't defend that here, but I have an entire paper I could send you and you could tell me why that one's wrong. But it's about sort of the nature of the reciprocity of rights, but I want to give Helen an opportunity to talk about this stuff, unless you don't want to.
Not right now.
Okay.
So let me just read you the list that I've got and tell me if I've missed you. Paul, Kai, Jeff, Adil, and Victor. Did I miss anyone? It's that. Okay.
Cool. Thanks. I want to thank Kim for raising some things I'm dissatisfied with about Helen's counter, even though I'm dissatisfied with Kim's issue. So my question picks on something that Kimberly didn't talk about, which is the claim that the defensive action or the deferred harming case is a case of it can't be defensive because the harm to honor is done. So the threat is done, the harm has been accomplished, right? This depends, I think, on a sort of richer account of what a harm to honor is than what we've got in the paper. And Kimberly started giving us more of this. But I have a question which doesn't Kimberly suggest we can get out of the deferred harming objection by saying, well, it's expressive. Right? I want to push a line of thinking about honor which suggests it's not deferred harming, which will depend on the account of what the harm to honor is. It's ongoing. So if you think about the harm to honor in this case, one way we can think about it is it creates an impression, a durable impression that the victim has forfeited or perhaps waived rights against certain kinds of treatment. And so, not talking about the rape case, talking about the bully case on the playground, right? Your kid gets beat up by a bully once, there's a harm there in being beat up, there's clearly a harm to honor, but it seems to be an ongoing harm to honor because it creates possibilities for future threats, right? It appears that you've waived your right against future threats. And so, if that's right, the bully will count as an indirect threat in any future case of harm. If the reason other kids pick on your kid is that they think you waived your right because of something the first bully did, it looks like I should have a right to attack the first bully, even in a deferred sense, in order to correct that mistaken impression. If your intuition's following you that far, it suggests that the threat created by the harm to honor is ongoing. So I'm not sure what you want to say. The principal threats created by the attack is ongoing, and that's how we're characterizing the threat to honor, or whether we want to say the threat to honor is continuing. And why would this matter? I think it matters when we scale up to the war cases, which is something we didn't get yet. Your discussion of the war cases suggests usually a concern about collateral damage that prevents us from defending our honor. I'm thinking of assassination cases, right? And so you can think of a case where you know you're going to assassinate the head of another state who's invaded your country, subjected to certain harms. It's not obvious to me that it's worse to defer the assassination than it is to do it at the moment that the harm is ongoing, right? It's going to be ineffective in both cases. That's what we're granting in the case. It's going to be ineffective to prevent the primary harm, but maybe it's not ineffective to prevent the harm to honor. Set it up.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. So I think those are interesting ideas. I mean, in the bully case, that's kind of a deterrent justification, right?
You can use the rape case if you prefer.
But I mean, a similar thought would apply, right? So, I mean, if we thought that this was something that would increase the chances of Franz being raped in the future, then we could have a deterrent type justification that seems like a different sort of justification than the on-race thing. But I take the general point that I certainly think that much more needs to be said about why it is that, so I mean, honor is, Jeff's been complaining about this for a while now, that using the phrase honor is misleading. I follow Statman in this, but actually I think something like moral standing is a better way of talking about this. Honor has all these connotations that we don't really want. And if we think about moral standing, then there is a question of, well, why is it that, as I say, once the physical threat is over, sort of that threat is, so I guess that's one way in which, clearly there's going to be what we might think of as sort of psychological harms that can persist in things like the bully case or the rape case after the actual attack. But I guess the thought is something like, it's a bit like once I've broken your leg, right? It might take 6 weeks to heal, or however long it takes for the broken leg to heal. But it's not like I still pose a threat to you because your leg's not healed yet.
But on my account, you might say you're contributing to the ongoing threat with the other children on the
Right,
playground.
but that would be a different justification because then what I'm trying to I'm trying to defend myself against future physical attacks, right? And that's different from so that's what I mean when I say the deterrence case seems to be one in which it looks like what would justify the harms is I'm trying to prevent other physical attacks on me. And that seems different from a case in which what's doing the work is this kind of reassertion of my moral standing. But I think that there's a nice interplay between my sort of status in the schoolyard has been undermined, that I become vulnerable to these attacks. But it still seems like we could get enough of what we could have the defense against future physical threats and the deterrent justification do the work, I think, that we would need to do in that case. But you know, these are interesting questions, I think.
Kai.
Yeah, I think this is related to Kim's point about provocation. I would say that in both the Lucky escape, or whatever that case is, and the rape case, that even if France says unjustified in trying to break Eric's wrist, and even if she's threatening his right not to have his wrist broken, she still wouldn't be herself liable to defense, because liability requires more than just posing an unjust threat. It requires that you be more responsible for that threat than the potential victim of the threat. And clearly, the one I blame Eric, I mean, if his wrist does get broken, I mean, I'd blame. So you're way more at fault for your broken wrist than Fran, crying out loud. You're the one who's trying to rape her. So that's why, I mean, so she wouldn't be liable. And that's, you don't have to resort to forfeiture or saying that her fighting back was justified to show that Eric is not going to be justified in using self-defense against Fran, because Fran's not liable to defense. So that's one point. The other 2 points, real quick. I think in the real, most likely case, when someone's, if you want to think about what's she thinking to try and think about these cases, you're just responding instinctively. You're just fighting back. I mean, when I've been attacked and fought back, I guarantee I felt like he deserves to get hit. I'm just flailing, and it's not helping. It's just an instinctive response. Maybe you have to think about it. I mean, it's just to keep it, centered on what's likely to be the case, the discussion. Also, maybe if you're going to look for justification for Fran breaking the wrist, is maybe one that's being ignored here a little bit, is the possibility it's a defense justification based on the idea that it would do her a lot more psychological damage to be raped without fighting back. And that could be very significant, I think.
Thanks, Kai. I think more needs to be said about this idea that that the attacker is morally responsible for the counter defense of the victim, and this kind of you started it idea. So I see the intuitive pull of it, but I think we need to spell out exactly how that would work, right? So take something like the Lucky escape case. In this case, it's only if victim acts that somebody has to get hurt, for example, because he can use the parachute and nobody gets hurt. It's only if he takes out the gun and decides to shoot that somebody has to suffer a harm now. So in a case like that, it's not clear why we would say that murder is more morally responsible, right, for the fact that somebody has to suffer a harm. So I think more needs to be said about how we show that in this case one person's more responsible than the other for the harm that's going to be suffered, right? Because this is a different harm than the initial threat that's being imposed. It's a new harm. And then we also need to think about things like, well, what would say Eric be morally responsible for? And if he's morally responsible for an unjust threat, right? If we're saying that Fran's breaking of his wrist is unjust because he's not liable to it, but Eric's morally responsible for it, it looks like we're saying, well, look, Eric's morally responsible for an unjust threat. But then we say, well, normally that would make somebody liable if they're morally responsible for an unjust threat. So I'm worried that there's a kind of tangle there about how we should think about these things. Because if he's morally responsible, but then worries, well, then it's not unjust because he's liable to it. So I think these things need to be pulled apart. So I share. I think this is a line that Jeff has pushed as well. That it's the way that internalists get around this is by saying, well, look, they started, they're responsible, they're more responsible for it. But wanting to still pull back from saying that means that they're liable for it. And I'm just not quite sure that there's a gap there.
Yeah, and I worked out the details in my new book. I'll roll it up.
Oh. I should actually just keep it.
If you want to get the details, I think journalism is exactly that way.
Lovely, thanks, guys.
It's always nice to have a bit of product like
Can I just jump in on this for what? So I I don't do the sort of, I wasn't urging you to do the comparative move that I think Kai and Jeff did, right? So I just want to know what you think about the following case, right? I decide, you know, I really want to start a fight with you, right? So I say everything it takes, right, to get you to try to punch me, right? Fill in the blank there, right? You go to swing, and the question is, do I get to knock you on the ground because you're about to hit me? I don't think we have to say, you know, you're the good guy or I'm the good guy. I think, you know, we're both bad guys, right? I'm actually not sure Victor should intervene against either of us, but I think the fact that I started the fight and aimed to provoke you to hit me is going to be sufficient for me to forfeit my rights. And I'm just wondering, are you really just not tempted by that at all?
Yeah, I'm not really. I really think that in case of provocation, there isn't a justification or even really much of an excuse. There might be some excuse for it, but I think that I shouldn't fight back, and you don't forfeit your rights by provoking me. As long as it's not physical,
Those are two separate questions, right? So you could wrong me without my being entitled to defend myself. So that's the claim. The claim is you will wrong me, you should go to jail or pay me some money, whatever, maybe not pay me money, but you should go to jail if you do something. But I am not allowed to defend against the very act that I provoked. Where we
so
get
that's
two
what
bad people.
I'm skeptical about. I don't think you lack defensive rights in that case. It's my intuition to that case.
Jeff.
Thanks. What I want to say follows on what's been said by Kai and a little bit by Kim. I want to just present a way of thinking about the lucky escape case, the unnecessary defense and then self-defense against unnecessary defense. I've put aside considerations of honor or affirmation of a person's moral dignity. And partly one can do that because if one assumes that the victim could parachute to safety, or more realistically, just maybe hide behind a bush or something like that, so that we wouldn't have the cost element to this. If we make the further assumption that this person will be able then to call the police, who will capture murderer and he'll be punished or whatever for an attempted murder, that in itself would be a sufficient assertion of the victim's moral status or moral dignity. That's not something that has to be done by the individual victim herself. It's done by the judicial system in a lot of cases. So put that aside. And in the case, victim is going to kill the murderer unnecessarily. It'll be effective, but it's unnecessary. In my view, because it's unnecessary, it's completely gratuitous. I think people have rights not to be harmed gratuitously. I think, therefore, murderer is not liable to be killed because this would actually achieve something that couldn't otherwise be achieved without harming him. So Helen and I disagree there. I think murderer is not liable to be killed. The question is, if the only way that murderer can prevent himself from being wrongly killed by victim is to kill victim, may he kill victim? Here's where Kai and I would appeal to the idea of comparative responsibility. What I claim is that no, he may not kill victim in self-defense. That doesn't, and the explanation is this, and here's where I think I've made perhaps one step forward. It's not because he's liable to be killed, but rather he's liable to allow himself to be killed. And you might think of this, if you think of a possibility of a third party. Suppose there's a third party present who can shoot victim or allow victim to shoot murderer. The third party mustn't shoot victim, but must allow murderer to be killed, and that's because murderer's greater responsibility for the choice that victim faces and so on, and for the choice that the third party faces, means that the burden should go to him if it can't be distributed in some other way. So the liability there is not liability to be killed, but liability to be allowed to be killed. But then, if murderer has some lesser option, if murderer could knock the gun from victim's hand, thereby injuring victim's hand, and wouldn't be able then to go on and murder victim. I mean, it's a condition of the permissibility of any defensive action that the murderer would not go on to. I mean, that wouldn't thwart the defensive action of the victim. Then I think that it would be permissible and the victim would be liable to the harm of having her hand injured as a means of preventing her from killing murderer, and that's because even though the murderer has greater moral responsibility, this is nonetheless a proportionate form of defense against what would be a profoundly wrongful harm, in my view, if the victim unnecessarily kills the murderer. So that's the way I would want to think about that case.
So how do you support the claim that murder has greater moral responsibility in Lucky's case for the fact that somebody has to suffer harm? I mean, okay, he started, but it's only because the victim decides to use force that somebody has to suffer harm. So why is murder more morally responsible?
Because it's more highly culpable to attempt to murder somebody than it is to make an effective form of defense against being murdered, even when it's unnecessary.
But on your view, isn't it? It's murder. Victim will be murdering murderer as well, right?
Victim will be wrongly killing murderer because it's unnecessary, yeah, and murderer is not liable to that harm. But I'm seeing the culpability of, and I think this it seems to be kind of obvious in a way that murderer started it wrongly. Murderer is a murderer, probably, and the victim is now murderer is kind of responding to a situation, responding wrongly, but something like that. Yeah, there would be some kind of excusing conditions present, I think that they're equally responsible for the.
I think that's a good enough argument, right? Because I mean, it's true. It might be true that victim has some excuse, but he's still going to murder murderer. He might have some excuse. We might think, as you know, murder's doing this bad thing to him, or whatever, and he's upset. But he's still the one who's thinking about the
the question is, I think everybody has my intuition here. Murderer may not kill victim in self-defense.
Right, I have that intuition too.
And the explanation for that is that of the two, even though they're both acting wrongly, murderer is the one who has created the situation in the first place, and murderer's culpability is clearly greater, it seems to me. And that's why we have that intuition. I mean, if the descriptions of the two were different, if, for example, the murderer were an innocent threatener, and the victim knew this and decided to kill, he wouldn't be murderer in this case, he'd be innocent, he'd be minimally responsible threatener, let's say. So it's no longer a case of murderer, it's minimally responsible killer and innocent victim. And innocent victim then chooses to kill minimally responsible killer rather than hide behind a bush, then I think it would be permissible for minimally responsible threatener suddenly realizing all the facts to kill victim. So it's a question of comparative culpability.
I'm not sure why, particularly you are taking the, created the situation, and why you're taking this situation to be when murderer attacks victim, at which point nobody has to suffer any harm, given that your view is so much about distributing harm that's inevitably got to befall somebody. That only kicks in when victim decides to use force. So why is created a situation that's relevant for thinking about distributing harm, not when victim decides to use force?
Stop answering questions with questions.
Sorry, does that make chairing very hard?
Well, it just means so we've got three people left. Three people left. Christian wanted to come in super quick on this, but there's only 10 minutes left, so it will be super quick.
Yeah, it was kind of a question for Jeff in this exchange, which is just about the how you move from the liability to be allowed to be killed to the impermissibility of killing the other.
Sorry, to be ruled out of order. You can't ask it with 10 minutes left. Yeah. So okay. So you guys continue that discussion afterwards, if that's all right, in lunch. And then Adil was the next question.
Okay. So three quick.
For one of these two people.
Yeah. No, so three quick things, mostly for Helen, maybe a little bit for Kim. First, we might not want to assume that punitive harming and deserved harming are the same things. It might be that if someone deserves to be harmed, it's just less wrongful to harm them, even if you have other intentions. And that might partly explain why victim, as Kyle pointed out, is not thinking about punishing rapists. And yet if rapist does deserve some harm, it might just be less wrongful. And so if her only motive is to defend her, or to assert her autonomy, well, maybe then that actually might justify this reduced harm, because he does deserve some harm.
Choose one of your other things.
Okay, I will. Helen, later in the book, or maybe earlier in the book, in the mistaken murder, or apparent murder, you say, okay, so if somebody, if Victor points a gun at me and I don't know that it's loaded, and I kill him, or I try to kill him, what is that? How should we think about that? You say, well, he's liable to attempted defensive killing. And so I was thinking about, well, why not look at the rape case like that? And I guess the answer is that because the victim doesn't think it's going to work. And I just point out, maybe you can attempt impossible things, right? So to paraphrase Alice in Wonderland, right? I attempt 7 impossible things before breakfast, right? It might be. And just to put the, so if, I do think that there's a difference. So if I attack Victor, and of course I'm much bigger and stronger than Victor, so he can't stop me, right? But there are 2 ways he could respond, right? One is to fight back futilely, right? Obviously futilely. The other is that Victor knows that I like my clothes, and so he grabs some cold coffee and just throws it on my clothes. Right? Yeah, right? Yeah, well, yeah, that shirt's already gone. And those feel different. One of those might be attempted self-defense, and you think, okay, you get it.
Okay, I actually did, yeah, okay. I didn't quite follow the coffee, I was just too busy laughing at Victor's shirt, but which looks awesome. Okay, thanks so much. So that's an interesting distinction between the punitive harm and the deserved harm. I guess I'd have to think more about how that would how we'd spell that out more. But yeah, and on the attempted murder thing, so that's actually the thing I was just saying to Kim that I think is a mistake, right? Because I think that if it's true that you can only be liable to instrumental harms, and you in this case, it turns out there is no threat that can be averted, then it looks like harming the person can't be instrumental. And so it looks like so is that not?
Oh, no.
So it looks like that's not something we should say about these cases. So I said that, look, people can be liable to harm to their victims inflict in the course of trying to defend themselves. But I think that can't be right, because if you can only be liable to instrumental harms and there's no threat, then the harm that the victim inflicts trying to defend herself, it looks like that can't be a harm that somebody's liable to.
So you've changed?
I think, I know, it's amazing, yeah.
No, you're very open-minded.
Yeah, so I think that must be wrong. Yeah.
So Victor, one question?
Sure, only one. I'm impressed by this honour thing, I have to say. So, I mean, I think the case is really distracting, some of the reasons that Kai had, that, it looks like when the person defends themselves, they might reduce the psychological harms and so on, and that's going to drive our intuition a lot about the case. Once we get cases where we build that out and build out some of the other distracting features, then, I mean, think about firing squads. This is a bit like Alice case. You've got a firing squad of 20 people who are going to shoot you. And you reach down in your pocket and you find a gun with 1 bullet, so you can shoot 1 member of the firing squad in the foot. And then you're dead. I don't mean, it's not making any difference shooting the 1 person in the foot. Let me tell you that. But my honour requires me to shoot the person in the foot. You just shouldn't shoot them. I mean, assuming desert skeptics like me are right, that people don't deserve it. That they're just unlucky to be these terrible people. Which is how I think of wrongdoers. It's just unfortunate for them, what a shame for them that they're wrongdoers. But in order to defend my honour, I can inflict some further harm on them with no extra reason, no deterrence reason, unless the desert is false because of the free will problem. And then we think, oh, but in order to defend my honour at the point of death, I ought to be able to shoot the person in the foot. I just think, really? It just seems like an unnecessary, pointless harm inflicted on a person. So I really. And then imagine the person who then thought to themselves, well, I'm not going to do this because I recognise that they're very important people too, and their lives matter as well. And I don't want to inflict this unnecessary harm. And I see myself fully as a person who has rights that are being violated. So I refrain from doing this. That person also, I think, has a perfectly sensible sense of dignity and self-worth. I don't think they're advancing their dignity and self-worth by shooting the person in the foot. So my sense is once we get rid of the case, because it's too distracting, once we replace it with these other cases, and we get rid of desert and deterrence, just unnecessary harm infliction just seems mean.
So I might, so I might in this case agree with you because you're stipulating that these people are just kind of like minimally morally responsible, almost, right? These people who are just unlucky.
They're fully culpable, but they're just
Well,
unlucky to be fully culpable people. That's how it is with wrongdoers, right?
I think maybe I'm struggling a little bit with that idea. But so it sounds to me like you're saying these people aren't really properly morally responsible.
Don't deserve it.
But then I might, so then I might share your intuition a bit more. But I bet you, if I have a fully culpable person who's going to kill me, I mean, we might say something like, look, you're not really securing any kind of good, right? We might say that these kinds of thoughts about kind of your moral standing and so on only kind of kick in if you're going to live for more than 5 seconds afterwards or something like that, right? So you've got to have some time when you feel better about what's happened or something like that. But I don't really share your intuition that it would be really bad to shoot the guy in the foot.
Because you're a retributivist.
All right.
Well,
Next question from next question for Seth.
Which follows on Alec distinction between the rape case and the multiple aggressors case. So I'm not sure that I got your view of proportionality, but why is it proportional to kill the first one in order to earn another 5 minutes of life, since the second one is going to kill you? Why is it proportional to do that? Especially now, suppose that they are fully culpable, all the aggressors are fully culpable, but they can be, go to a kind of a program that will make them very good people. So, and you know that in advance, and just now, I think that the victim might say, look, I'm going to die anyway in 5 minutes, so why should I kill this first aggressor if he can go to a program and become a normal person.
Yeah,
Something
well,
like that.
so I mean, I think
Now,
we
so-
always have
So
problems.
it's necessary, I agree that it is necessary to kill the first aggressor in order to eliminate the rights violation, but proportionality seems to rule it out because you have no interest in killing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always have problems with these almost dead cases. I mean, I'm not going to, I think, give you a full, but if I'm lying there sick and Helen says, oh, Kim's going to die in 5 minutes, freebie, I've always wanted to kill someone. I mean, it doesn't strike, it strikes me that what she's doing is murder, right? And so...
So tell me your story about proportionality in this case.
Well, so I think it's...
The good effects of the killing should outweigh the bad effects of the killing.
Well, the good effect is that I am, at that moment, I am preserving my life, right?
Preventing a murder.
I'm preventing Helen from violating my right.
Well, you've also got a better answer. If you're not wronging the person who's going to kill you, then they're just interests and you can prefer your own interests.
I'll take
Okay,
that
so I
too.
think that
But
brief
no,
moment of silence.
wait, can I just, I agree with Alec and with your point that there's questions. I actually had told Victor, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, there was this action individuation and how we really parse this and what is the wrong or the harm and how we should think about it. And I think that there's more to trying to figure out what counts as successful defense than the quick, Danny Statman gets the multiple aggressor cases wrong. I agree with that.
Okay, so with that, let's thank you for a great paper.